This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Thank you, Charles, and I want to begin by thanking not only Charles but Jan Loop and the other organizers of the conference here. It's a great pleasure for me to be in the Warburg Institute. Every time I come here, I think maybe I'll just move in and make a bed behind some of the bookshelves somewhere and just stay. It's the perfect place to do the research that I have spent the last 25 years working on. As Charles mentioned, I am at the moment working on, in the middle of working on a book about the Dominican friars and their interaction with the Qur'an between about 1240 and 1320. I begin here with a famous painting by El Greco of Dominic himself in prayer, Dominic wearing the black and white Dominican habit. Dominic, the inspiration for this order, the order of preachers, who would very quickly become the most learned order, religious order in the Western Church in the High Middle Ages, and of course they remain a very highly scholarly order to this day. Though the Dominicans were founded to be preachers preaching the gospel to the Albigensian heretics, the non-Orthodox Christians, particularly in southern France in the late 12th and early 13th century, the Dominicans quickly morphed, as it were, into having interests in all sorts of other non-Christian groups, especially Jews and Muslims, and uniquely among the religious orders of the Latin Middle Ages, developed special schools in which select friars could learn Arabic and Hebrew and Aramaic so as to be able to read the texts of and speak the languages of Jews and Muslims. What I want to do today is talk about two of the friars who were produced in this process, became extremely advanced in their knowledge of Arabic, and spent a great deal of time interacting with Islamic religious texts. And in doing so, I want to chart what I think is a kind of an interesting transition that the study and translation of the Qur'an during this period, a transition that I think has in other times and in other places been followed in something of a similar way. And it's a transition from reading the Qur'an very much within the Islamic tradition, in Islamic space, in medieval Spain, surrounded by other Arabic Islamic books, to a reading of the Qur'an that even in the second Dominican I'm going to talk about, who is reading it in Arabic, but he's reading it an assemblage of other Arabic books, other Qur'an commentaries and that kind of thing. He begins and devotes himself enormously to a careful sort of combing through of the Qur'an, but he does so almost in complete absence from any other Islamic texts. A process that I think is worth thinking about. It very much happens in our own day. Now, before I say anything about the two Dominican friars, I want to mention a couple kinds of works or works that I'll be referring back to in both of their cases. The first is the enormous literature of commentaries on the Qur'an. This is a picture of a modern edition of the famous Qur'an commentary of At-Tabari from the Middle Ages, and I want to stress that this is an enormous amount of literature that supplements the Qur'an, which in itself is not a particularly long book. This is all a commentary on that book, and this is not the only commentary that is this gigantic from the Middle Ages. There is a huge literature, just as there is around virtually every other religious text, of commentary on that text. And one of the things I'll be talking about is the extent to which these Dominican friars have knowledge of Quranic tafsir or commentary. But there are other kinds of texts they are looking at while they're studying the Qur'an, and there are two Christian texts that in particular are on their tables, on their desks, we might say, as they read the Qur'an. And one is a Latin translation of the Qur'an, the translation 1212 by of Toledo. I and other people have written a fair amount about this translation in other places. I'm not going to say much about it, other than to point out that it is a translation that was in many ways made within a world of Islamic books. This translator either knew commentaries directly or was in conversation with Muslim informants who explained the meaning of the Quran to him, he often taking the language of the Quranic commentaries and putting it right into his Latin translation. A book that was on their desks is a relatively obscure work called the Liber Denudationis, the Book of Revealing. These are both appear in the same manuscript that I'm showing you here. This is a work that originally was written in Arabic in the 11th or 12th century in Al-Andalus, written by a Christian who is extremely knowledgeable of the Quran, but other Islamic books like commentaries and collections of hadith. It is lost in its Arabic original. There is no manuscript that we know of to have survived, but it was translated into Latin by some point in the late 13th century, and interestingly enough survives only in one manuscript, in this one in Paris. And despite the fact that it seems to have been read, as far as I can tell, only by these two friars I'm going to talk about, it would go on to have an enormous influence on Western thinking about Islam for reasons I'll get to in a little bit. So bear those in mind as I go now to talk about the two Dominican friars in question. The first of them is a Spanish. We don't know between about 1250 and 1284. He was an active Dominican scholar. He had been trained in the very advanced education that all friars went through, including the study of Aristotelian philosophy, influence from Arabic philosophers along with it. He both studied at the Dominican schools for Arabic and then taught at them. He also learned Hebrew and Aramaic extremely well as well. He was perhaps the greatest European linguist of his age. In the early part of his career, he wrote largely about Islam in a couple of works, one with the explanation of the Apostles' Creed. This is really an explanation of the Apostles' Creed for Muslims, to try to persuade Muslims to believe in it. And then secondly, and more influentially, in a work called On the Sect of the Muslims, a treatise that itself would go on and have a fair amount of influence. Latter particularly, he cites the Quran frequently, very often probably most often in his own translation from the Arabic text directly. Now, I want to stress that in many ways, Ramon Martí, Iberian that he was, and perhaps someone who grew up actually with knowledge of Arabic as well as Romance, did have access to a lot of kinds of Arabic books that he clearly was reading while he read and translated the Quran. For one thing, he had knowledge of and knew how to consult Arabic commentaries on the Quran. And I'll give you just one example of this. And I want to stress that typically when he's doing this, he is doing it for polemical purposes. Commentaries to find things that will help him make arguments against Islam. And this is an example. The famous but puzzling first verse of the Surah of the Moon, Surah 54, a verse that reads just that: the hour approached and the moon split. It's a rather cryptic verse, and the text immediately goes on to talk about something else. So that verse has always been the occasion of a lot of discussion within Muslim and non-Muslim circles. In the Islamic world, a tradition very quickly developed that said that this verse referred to an event in the past, a miraculous event. One night, Muhammad was standing outside of Mecca, and some of the members of the Quraysh tribe asked for a miracle, and so he pointed at the moon in two pieces and fell down, one piece on either side of Mecca, and there are slightly different versions of the story that circulate as well. So if you turn to Quranic commentaries, that's generally the interpretation that they advance. Insisting, in other words, that these words refer to a time in the time of the prophet. They are in the past. The problem is that grammatically they could well refer to the future as well. And there was a sort of a minority view that you find in the commentaries that in fact this verse referred to the day of judgment, and the hour talked about here is the hour of judgment. And when it comes, then the moon will split. And Ramon Martí, as he's scanning through the commentaries, trying to find out what Muslims say about this, hits upon the latter view, which is that this thing will happen on the day of judgment. And he says, aha, this is what I need, because I want to refute notion that Muhammad worked any miracles, and he wants to do it because for him and other Christians, the working of miracles is the part of the definition of being a prophet. And he says, this is the way I can do it. I can insist that commentators say, at least some of them, that this event is actually going to happen in the future, and that Muhammad can't have been a miracle worker. And so, Latin translation of his own, he says that a certain commentator holds this latter view, and therefore we don't have to imagine that this miracle ever really happened. This is a fairly sophisticated use of the tafsirs, and he uses them in other places. He also uses the Baba tafsir from Bukhari's hadith collection as well. And I want to stress just briefly that he knows a lot of other Arabic books, as for example collections of hadith, the short traditions that are related about the Prophet's doings and statements. This is a page of a modern edition of hadith in Arabic and English. And you see this is one hadith here, a relatively short of one of the deeds of the Prophet. And the hadith consists of enormous collections of these kind of works. And he cites hadith collections actually by name book. So it's relatively easy to go and find his information from. And he knows a lot of other Arabic books too. He really knew Arabic philosophy quite well and read a lot of that directly in Arabic too. When we look, we see somebody who, like Mark of Toledo, that earlier translator or polemicist, really is immersed in a lot of ways in a world of Arabic texts. Nevertheless, we also find him using Christian texts here and there, in particular the two I mentioned. I don't think this has ever been noticed before. I'm pretty sure it hasn't. But he, at points when he cites the Qur'an, cites it in Latin versions that are identical with Mark of Toledo's version. And I just want to mention one example briefly, having to do with verse 347 of the Qur'an. This is Mary speaking to Gabriel, saying, has touched me. And there's a feature of Arabic language that I need to stress here, and that is that what joins the two, the conjunction that joins the two clauses together is actually wa, which technically means and. That's the normal word for and. But this, grammarians of Arabic say, I don't remember how the Arabs explain it, but Western grammarians call this a so-called wow of preceding circumstance, an and of preceding circumstance that and, but it really understood as when translated into, And what's striking is that both Mark of Toledo and Ramon Martí have an identical version of this verse with the same error in it. How will there be a son? No man has touched me. So we have an identical version of the text with an identical error, which suggests very strongly to me that he at least knew Mark's translation in part. He also, I think very strongly, knew this book of revealing. There's at least one passage that is virtually identical between the two works. It's a passage that is the third chapter of the book of revealing. Explain the whole context of the complicated, but he's telling us that Muhammad says in the Qur'an in the Surah Al-Hijr that we made the remembrance of God be sent down and we will protect it. So this is God speaking, as is generally the case in the Qur'an. This little bit is his dig at Muslims, that Muhammad, when he wrote this, what he thinks of as a fake scripture, all of God. And what he's getting at is the final thing, that he's claiming that the Torah and the Gospel are what are meant here by the word remembrance. The Arabic word in this case is dhikr. Another typical Christian gambit says that God is the Bible and therefore the Bible must. This message occurs identically with works. What's interesting about it is that and you think, well, how in the world? I think Ramon had the Arabic version that's now lost of this text, translated from the Arabic version. The Latin version that we have is a different Latin translation. They both exactly the same point, but they're two different Latin versions. But it suggests to me strongly that he knew this text. So he's reading a lot of Arabic books alongside the Qur'an. He's also reading some Christian books, including a Latin translation as well. When we move now to his younger confrere, Recoldo Damante di Croce, another remarkably learned Dominican friar who knew Arabic very well, had a very sound knowledge of this language, and who had traveled a great deal in the Middle East, perhaps upward of 10 years. He certainly spent a fair amount of time there. This is a contemporary picture of him from a manuscript of one of his works. We see him in the Dominican habit. We see him looking rather amiable here. I'm not sure that he was. In fact, I think he was a very, very obsessive, intense guy, and I can talk about that perhaps in question period, but he seems amiable here at least. Having come back from the Middle East, he wrote actually 4 different works that deal with Islam in varying ways. I only want to talk about one, the most important of these, a treatise called Contra Legem Saracenorum, Against the Religion of the Muslims, which is undoubtedly the most influential treatise against Islam of the whole later Middle Ages. Is often many manuscripts of it. Wanted to know about Islam, read it. And if we look at this treatise, and if we look at something else, that is his own manuscript of the Quran in Arabic, which survives to this day in Paris. This is Arabic language 384 from the Bibliothèque Nationale. We find his handwriting. You see handwriting on this folio. There's an older cursive set. And then we have Recoldo's remarkably careful Italian rotunda Gothic script, which I think is very odd for somebody writing annotations. Usually annotations are really messy. This guy, he writes them, it doesn't show up very well here, he writes them in really very nice text hand. This is an obsessive kind of guy. If we look at both of these, we get a really strong picture of how he went about reading the Quran. And I can only go into this just a little bit. I might point out that my friend and colleague Jose Martinez Gasquez, who's sitting in the back here, and Francois Desroches at the National Library in France have been for a few years preparing an edition of these notes. So we can look forward to having those come out, I hope soon. If we look at both of these kinds of things, we find some remarkable things about his Quran reading. First of all, it's clear that he does know of somehow Quranic commentaries. And it's not easy to explain how he had access to them in Florence at the beginning of the 14th century, but whether he brought a tafsir back with him, or whether he had notes from tafsir, he certainly knew of it, and we find him occasionally citing Quranic commentaries in the margins of his manuscript. And there's a famous case here on this folio. We're in the, in the 34th surah, and this note up here concerns this verse, 34:14, which reads, "And when we decreed for him," that is Solomon, nothing showed his death save a creeping creature of the earth which gnawed away his staff. Another kind of puzzling verse when you think about it. And a big tradition of commentary in the Islamic tradition developed about it. What was going on here? And Ricoldo obviously knew one of the main ways of interpreting this text in commentaries, because he writes it up here. Right up here he writes glossa, his word for commentary, and then this long note basically is a translation that's used to explain this, a hadith that says that when Solomon died, he was leaning on his staff, and the jinn, those sometimes mischievous spirits, wanted to sort of play a joke on Solomon's followers, so they had him stay upright while dead, leaning on his staff for a year. And the only way that they knew he died, the termite, an arda, came and ate the inside of the staff out, and then he finally fell over. Now, why Ricoldo wrote this tradition up at the top of this is not at all clear to me. He does so several other times in his manuscript. But what's striking is that, let me go back to that. What's striking is that he never cites any commentaries at all in his work against Islam. When he writes against Islam, he focuses just on the Quran itself. He's not interested in any way in what Muslims think about it. He's moving the text, you see, moving the Quran out of its world of accompanying texts in a remarkable way. Rather, what we find him doing is having his Quran reading and translation shaped by precisely the two Christian books that I mentioned before, now in a very, very large way. First of all, he had with him, I think, all the time when he read the Quran in Arabic, he had Mark of Toledo's Latin translation of that text. There are marginal notes on, I don't know, probably half the folios, half the pages of that copy of the Quran. And we can ask Jose later, but I think something like 65% of the time, those notes are simply copied from Mark of Toledo's translation. He has simply, he's doing what difficult texts at times. He's got his facing page, Arabic and Latin, open in front of him to help him understand this text better. And he copies it in the margin a great deal. And we have an interesting example at the beginning of the 68th surah, the Surat al-Qalam, which begins by the phrase wal qalam, meaning by the pen, and what are called oath-saying surahs. And Mark of Toledo, interestingly enough, and I can't go into this because I don't have time, translates it this way: per piscum et calamum, by the fish. By the way, this is one of the few cognates between Arabic and Latin that there is. He has a good reason for putting this in here. I can talk about it later if you'd like. What we find next to that surah at the beginning of, in Ricoldo's own copy of the Quran in his own hand, is exactly the same phrase. He's clearly copied it out of Mark's translation. And in fact, when we look at his big work against Islam, against the religion of the Muslims, about 25% of the Quranic quotations that he uses in Arabic actually are drawn from Mark's Quran. So it was clearly a big part of his study of the Quran. Secondly, this book of revealing that I mentioned, this obscure book that hardly survived the Middle Ages, was with him all the time as well. And other scholars, especially modern Dominican scholars, have shown very precisely the extent to which his Against the Muslim Religion is in many ways a kind of a retelling of the Book of Revealing. The Book of Revealing clearly shaped precisely how he understood the Qur'an and how he went about reading it himself. It was the biggest influence on his conception of Islam. So that 21% of the quotations in that text come from the Book of Revealing directly. Now that does mean, and I want to stress this, that the remaining 50-something odd percent come from other sources, and the majority of those are Ricoldo himself. They're clearly Ricoldo translating the text himself. He has, as I mentioned, an advanced knowledge of the Qur'an, and one of the things we find him doing, by the way, is that he often corrects Marco Toledo's translation. Sometimes he corrects it when he first writes it in the margin, and it further when he uses the same text in his own work against Islam. This is this obsessive thing. He really says. Well, what might we conclude about these followers of Dominic who had such advanced knowledge of Arabic? Well, I think it's very clear that these are really well-trained scholars, but I think what's striking is the way that the farther we move from the 13th century in time, from the early 13th century in time, and the farther we move in distance from Iberia, the more is the Qur'an read only by itself and not with these other Islamic books. And I mention that I think it's an important part of the process of one religion studying another one. I think it happens a great deal. It certainly happens now. In my own country, there are lots and lots of people who have read the Qur'an and no other Islamic work at all, and make all sorts of claims about what it means and what it says without ever consulting the huge body of literature that has shaped that understanding. Thank you.